The simplest and smallest sort of data that you can store persistently on disk in an Android app is called a preference. There are a couple of different ways of creating preferences in an application, and they're sometimes referred to as simply preferences and sometimes as shared preferences. You can initialize preferences either in Java code or through a preference activity, a visual interface that you create just like you do any activity. Each preference value is a simple key-value pair. The keys are always strings, but the values can have one of a number of different types, including booleans, integers, longs, floats, and strings. It's also possible to create a single preference value that consists of multiple strings that are typed as a Java set. You can create your preferences in Java by using a class called Shared Preferences. You start by creating an instance of this class. Whenever you create a Shared Preferences object, you always assign a mode, and the most common is called mode_private. This means that the preferences in this set will be private to the current application and are only accessible with the application that has this current package. There are other mode constants available in the API, such as mode world writable, but as of Jelly Bean, that's Android 4.2, sharing of preferences between apps isn't currently supported. There's a note in the API docs to this effect. That capability might be supported in future versions. When you create a set of preferences, you indicate whether the preferences are private to the current activity or shared between multiple activities. And you do this by assigning a name. If you call the getPreferences method and simply pass in mode private, you're saying create a set of preferences that are unique to the current activity. If you call getSharedPreferences, then you have to pass in an explicitly activity set name as a string, and then you can reuse that name from other activities and get to those same values. If you call getPreferences, there's still a name associated with that set. It's the name of the current activity, but the intention is that those are private to the activity and that anything you call with getSharedPreferences are shared with the entire application. You can also choose to initialize your preferences using an activity. The advantage of preference activities is that they handle all the creating of the values and writing them to disk automatically for you. You don't have to assign a name because preferences that are created through an activity are always available to the entire application. There's a more limited set of data types that you can use with preferences created in this way. These values can be Boolean, strings, or lists of strings. You can't easily create integers, floats, or longs. In order to create a preference activity, you'll define it in a layout file. The code in these layout files will look similar to the layout files used to create your own custom activities, but the names of the elements are strictly defined. Once you've defined the preference activity, you can navigate to it using exactly the same sort of code that you would with any activity, by creating an intent and then asking to go to that activity through the intent. You'll see some differences in how activities are created depending on what version of the SDK you're targeting. Prior to Android 3, Honeycomb, a preference activity was created in a single XML file. Starting in Honeycomb and continuing through Jelly Bean, you can use the Fragment API and put together a preference activity using one or more fragments that are then pieced together at runtime. I'll show you both approaches to creating preferences, defining them through pure Java code or defining them through an activity, and then show you how to read those preferences into memory and how to listen for changes to preferences that might happen at runtime. As you decide how to put preferences to work in your application, here are two very important things to know about them. First of all, preference values are not encrypted. They're stored to your Android device's persistent storage as simple, unencrypted XML files. And that means that you should never store sensitive information that you haven't explicitly encrypted. The second thing is that preferences can be easily deleted by the user. The user can go into the Settings app or into the application list and say that they want to remove application data, and it will be completely wiped from persistent storage and won't be recoverable. So in using preferences in your application, Make sure that your app knows how to get started from scratch if the preferences don't already exist. I'll be showing you how to code for preferences so that when you read a preference, you can always provide a default value, a value that you'll work with if in fact the preference has never been set or has been previously set and then deleted. So let's get started learning how to code with preferences, both in Java and with the preference activity.